My name is Arthur Coleman. I'm 62 years old, and for 35 of those years, I was a conservation officer with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I've spent more nights under a canopy of pine and stars than I have under a shingled roof. The woods were never a place of fear for me. They were a place of logic, of predictable patterns, of life and death playing out a dance I understood. I could read the story of a week in a single bent twig or a patch of disturbed soil. I knew the call of every bird, the track of every animal. The forest spoke a language, and I was fluent. That fluency is gone now. The language is still there, but I can no longer hear it. All I hear is the silence that comes after a scream. My cabin sits, or sat, I should say, on 40 acres bordering the Ottawa National Forest in the UP. It wasn't a fancy place, just a single-room log structure I built with my own hands 30 years ago. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a propane lamp, and a well-worn armchair that faced a window looking out into a stand of old-growth hemlock. It was my sanctuary, the one place on earth where the noise of the world fell away, and I could simply be. It was where I went to reset my own internal compass. The first week of November always meant two things: the air turning sharp enough to bite, and the arrival of Jake and Brian. Jake was a good friend, a decade and a half younger than me, a carpenter from Marquette, who was as comfortable in the woods as I was. We'd hunted together since he was a boy. He was solid, dependable. Brian was his brother-in-law, a software guy from Grand Rapids. He was a different breed entirely. Brian wasn't a bad man, just a city man. The woods made him nervous, and he covered that nervousness with a layer of loud jokes and misplaced confidence. Every year, Jake would drag him up for the hunt, and every year I'd have to teach Brian the basics all over again. Firearm safety, how to read a compass, why you don't wear cologne when you're trying to track a white tail. It was a ritual. Jake would roll his eyes, I'd try to be patient, and Brian would treat the whole thing like a corporate team-building exercise that he was determined to win. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of slate, spitting a cold, intermittent drizzle. Jake's old Ford rumbled down my long gravel driveway, and he stepped out with a wide grin, clapping me on the shoulder. Brian emerged from the passenger side, bundled in a brand-new $1,000 camouflage jacket that was so clean it practically squeaked. "Art, you old hermit," Jake said, his breath fogging in the air. "Still haven't been dragged off by a bear, I see." "Not for lack of trying," I replied, shaking his hand. "Brian, good to see you. That jacket looks warm." "Only the best," Brian said, puffing his chest out. "Got this new scent-blocking technology. The deer will never even know I'm there. It's like I'm a ghost." Jake and I exchanged a look. "A very bright, very noisy ghost," Jake muttered under his breath, and I had to suppress a laugh. It was the usual start to our week. Normal. Everything about it was completely and utterly normal. We unloaded their gear, stacked firewood on the porch, and that evening we sat around the wood stove, cleaning our rifles and talking about hunts past. The familiar weight of my old Remington in my hands, the smell of gun oil and wood smoke, the low murmur of friendly conversation, these were the things that anchored me. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. We were out before dawn, moving through a thick section of cedar swamp about 2 miles east of the cabin. The air was still and frigid. We were moving slow, Jake and I in silent tandem, Brian crunching along behind us like a parade. I was about to signal for a stop when the smell hit me. It was the coppery, metallic stench of blood, heavy and thick on the cold air. I held up a hand, and even Brian knew to freeze. We followed the scent for another 50 yards, and then we found it. It was a doe, or what was left of one. She was lying in a small clearing, and the scene was one of pure carnage. But it was a strange kind of carnage. I've seen hundreds of predator kills in my career. Wolf, coyote, bear, cougar. They all have a signature. This had none of them. The doe's neck was broken, a clean, brutal snap, but her torso was ripped open with a violence that was almost surgical. The rib cage was shattered, but not crushed inwards like you'd see from a bear. The ribs were bent outwards, snapped at the spine, as if something had reached inside and pulled the entire structure apart from within. Her entrails were gone, not scattered and eaten on sight, just gone. There were no drag marks, no sign of scavengers, just the ruined carcass lying in a pool of frozen blood. "What the hell did this?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide. He knelt, careful not to disturb the ground around the body. I circled the kill, my eyes scanning for tracks. There were deer tracks everywhere, panicked and deep, but the predator's tracks were confused, muddled in the churned-up snow and mud. I found one partial print that made no sense. It was huge, far bigger than any black bear track, and oddly elongated. "Bear," Brian said, his voice a little shaky. "Has to be. A big one. A really, really big one." I shook my head. No bear did this. A bear is messy. It crushes. It mauls. This is different. It's like it was dismantled. I pointed to the rib cage. "You see this? Nothing I know of does this. And where are the guts? A predator eats the organs first. They're the most nutritious part." The woods around us were silent, not the usual quiet of the forest, filled with the distant call of a jay or the rustle of a squirrel. This was a dead silence, oppressive, the kind of silence that means every living thing is hiding from something far bigger and more dangerous than they are. The hair on my arms stood up. It was a primal feeling, a warning from a part of the brain that predates language. We were being watched. "Let's go," I said, my voice low and firm. "We're heading back. The hunt's off for today." Brian started to protest, something about not being scared off by some mangy bear, but Jake cut him off with a sharp look. He'd felt it too. The wrongness. We walked back to the cabin in a tight group, my hand never straying far from the rifle slung over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched followed us all the way home. That night, the temperature plummeted. A bitter wind rattled the window panes and moaned in the chimney. We sat inside, the warmth of the wood stove a small comfort against the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over us. We tried to talk, to restore the easy camaraderie of the night before, but the image of that mutilated doe was stuck in our minds. We kept our rifles close. It was well after midnight when we heard the first sound. I was half asleep in my armchair, the fire banked low. It was a deep, resonant thump. It came from the woods, far off, but clear in the still, cold air. I sat bolt upright. Jake was already awake, his head cocked. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, a slow, deliberate beat, like a giant knocking on a hollow log. It wasn't a woodpecker. It wasn't a falling branch. The sound was too powerful, too intentional. "What is that?" Brian whispered from his cot, his bravado from the afternoon completely gone. "I don't know," I said honestly. I had spent a lifetime listening to the sounds of the North Woods, and this was not one of them. The thumping continued for another minute, then stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. We waited, listening, for what felt like an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and we drifted into an uneasy sleep. but I kept the loaded 12-gauge leaning against my chair. The next morning, I was the first one up. I stoked the fire and put the coffee on, but my mind was outside. As soon as there was enough gray light to see, I pulled on my boots and my heavy coat and stepped out onto the porch. A fresh inch of snow had fallen overnight, blanketing everything in a clean, white sheet. And there, leading from the dense tree line to within 20 yards of my cabin, was a line of tracks. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the shotgun from just inside the door and walked slowly down the porch steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tracks were impossible. They were bipedal. 2 legs, a long stride. Each print was nearly 18 inches long, shaped something like a massive canine paw, but with a distinct heel and a splayed, almost hand-like pattern at the front. They were sunk a good 4 inches into the snow, indicating something of incredible weight. The tracks came out of the woods, walked a wide circle around the cabin, and then went back into the trees on the other side. It had been observing us, sizing us up. Jake came out, a mug of coffee in his hand. He stopped dead when he saw the tracks, the coffee forgotten. "Art, what in God's name is that?" "I have no idea," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Brian joined us, took one look, and actually laughed, a short, nervous bark. "Okay, very funny. Who are your friends, Art? Did you get a couple of guys to come out here with some big fake feet to mess with the city boy?" "Nobody is messing with you, Brian," I said sharply, my eyes still scanning the dark wall of trees. "This is real." "Real? Come on. Bigfoot? Is that what we're saying here? You guys are trying to spook me." His refusal to see what was right in front of him was infuriating, but it was born of fear. His mind couldn't accept the reality of it, so it manufactured a more palatable explanation. But Jake and I knew. We knew that no man could make tracks like this, and no known animal walked on 2 legs and left a print the size of a snowshoe. We spent the day securing the cabin. We boarded up the smaller back window and reinforced the main door with a heavy log. Brian alternated between mocking us for our paranoia and nervously helping, his hands shaking. We didn't hunt. The thought of going back into those woods was unthinkable. We were no longer the hunters. We were the prey. As dusk fell, a thick fog rolled in, reducing visibility to less than 30 feet. It blanketed the woods in a ghostly silence. The world shrank to the small circle of light cast by our propane lamp inside the cabin. We ate our canned stew in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The comfortable sanctuary of my cabin now felt like a trap, a flimsy wooden box in a world of teeth and darkness. The sound started earlier that night. It began with a low growl that seemed to come from all directions at once, a guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of our boots. Then came the scraping, a long, slow, deliberate scraping sound against the west wall of the cabin. It sounded like a thick claw being dragged down the logs, testing the strength of the wood. Brian was pale, huddled on his cot. Jake stood by the main window, his rifle held at the ready. I was by the door, shotgun in hand, listening. The scraping stopped. A moment later, we heard a heavy, wet, sniffing sound, right at the window Jake was guarding. A deep inhalation, then a huff of breath that fogged the outside of the glass. Jake jumped back as if he'd been burned. "It's right there," he breathed. "It's looking in." We couldn't see anything through the fog and the darkness, just the vague impression of a massive shape blotting out what little light there was. Then we heard a sound that was far more terrifying than any growl. It was the soft, metallic click of the doorknob turning, slowly, deliberately. The heavy wooden bar I had set in place groaned under the pressure. Something was outside, standing on my porch, trying to open my door like a person. It tested the knob for a long moment, then stopped. There was a long silence. We stood frozen, straining to hear. 10 minutes passed. 20. The tension was unbearable. "Maybe it's gone," Brian whispered, his voice cracking. He was sweating despite the chill in the cabin. I have to go. I can't hold it." "You'll use the bucket in the corner," I said, not taking my eyes off the door. "I can't. Not with you guys. I'll just be quick." Off the porch. "It's gone, right?" He was pleading, looking for any excuse to believe he was safe. "You are not going outside," Jake said, his voice flat and hard. "Sit down, Brian." But Brian was panicking. His logic was gone, replaced by a desperate, primal need. "It's fine. It's gone. I'll be 10 seconds. Before either of us could stop him, he scrambled to the door, fumbled with the latch, and lifted the bar. He slipped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. We heard his footsteps on the porch steps, then the crunch of snow. "Brian, you damn fool," Jake yelled, moving to the door. Then came the scream. It wasn't a long scream. It was short, high-pitched, and filled with a kind of surprised agony I had never heard before. It was cut off with a sickening, wet, crunching sound. And then, silence. A silence more profound and terrible than anything that had come before. For a heartbeat, Jake and I were frozen in disbelief. Then adrenaline hit me like a physical blow. "Stay back from the door," I yelled, shoving Jake away from it as I slammed the wooden bar back into its brackets. We grabbed our rifles and our most powerful flashlights. "The window!" Jake shouted. We rushed to the main window, peering out into the fog-shrouded darkness. I clicked on my light, its beam cutting a bright, useless cone into the white mist. And then I saw it. At the very edge of the light, just before it was swallowed by the fog, was a shape. It was monstrously tall, standing impossibly on two powerful, backward-jointed legs. It was covered in thick, dark fur. It was dragging something that I knew was Brian. The shape paused, turning its head toward the light from the cabin. I saw the silhouette of a long, canine snout. I saw the glint of two large, intelligent, yellow eyes that reflected the beam of my flashlight with a cold, hateful luminescence. It was not a bear. It was not a man. It was something else entirely, something torn from the pages of a forgotten nightmare. It held our gaze for a single, terrifying second. Then it turned and melted back into the fog, taking Brian with it. The cabin was suddenly a tomb. The silence that followed was broken only by our own ragged, panicked breathing. Brian was gone. The impossible thing from the woods was real, and it had taken him. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat, but 35 years of training kicked in. Panic gets you killed. "Barricade it," I said, my voice sounding distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Everything we have. The table, the cots, push it all against the door." Jake, his face a mask of shock and grief, nodded numbly. We worked in a frenzy, our movements clumsy with fear. We shoved the heavy oak table against the door, piled the metal-framed cots on top of it. It was a flimsy defense against something that large, but it was all we had. We were trapped. The creature did not stay gone for long. We heard it circling the cabin, its heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. A low, continuous growl rumbled through the log walls. It knew we were in here. It was toying with us. Or worse, it was thinking. A loud crash from the back of the cabin made us both jump. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting the wall. Then another, and another. It was throwing things. I crept to the small, boarded-up back window and peeked through a crack. I could see shapes flying out of the darkness, rocks, chunks of firewood from the pile on the porch, striking the cabin with incredible force. This wasn't a dumb animal. A bear doesn't throw projectiles. This was tactical. It was testing for weaknesses. The bombardment stopped. The silence returned, thick with menace. We waited, rifles aimed at the door, straining our ears. Then, a new sound. A scratching at the main window, the one we had looked out of. A single sharp claw, tracing a line down the thick, reinforced glass I had installed years ago. And then, a face appeared in the window. My mind simply refused to process it for a second. It was too large, too close, too real. The head was that of a colossal wolf or a timber shepherd, covered in matted black fur. Its snout was long, its lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs the size of my thumbs. But the eyes were the worst part. They were not the simple, reactive eyes of an animal. They were a sickening, intelligent yellow, burning with a palpable hatred and cunning. They looked at us, understood what we were, and despised us. Its body was a nightmare of mismatched anatomy. It stood on 2 legs, easily 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were immense, wider than the window frame, packed with thick, corded muscle. Its arms were too long for its body, ending in huge 5-fingered hands that were disturbingly human-like, if not for the thick, black claws that tipped each digit. It was a perversion of nature, a thing that should not exist. It stared at us for a long moment, its hot breath fogging the glass. Then it raised one of its massive hands and slammed its fist into the window. The reinforced pane cracked with a sound like a gunshot, spiderwebbing from the point of impact. It roared, a deafening, guttural sound that was a mixture of a wolf's howl and a lion's roar, but deeper, more resonant. It hit the window again, and this time the glass shattered, exploding inwards and showering the floor with glittering shards. Jake and I opened fire simultaneously, the cabin filled with the deafening thunder of our rifles. I saw my rounds hit its shoulder, tearing through fur and flesh. Jake's shots struck its chest. The creature recoiled, roaring in what sounded more like fury than pain, and staggered back from the window, disappearing into the darkness. "Did we get it?" Jake yelled over the ringing in my ears. "I don't know." We reloaded with shaking hands. The smell of gunpowder filled the small space, acrid and sharp. For a moment there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the broken window. We thought, we hoped, we had driven it off. Then we heard a new sound, coming from above, a heavy scraping and tearing on the roof. It hadn't retreated. It had just changed its angle of attack. It was on the roof, trying to tear its way in. We could hear the heavy cedar shakes being ripped away, the sound of its claws digging into the underlying planks. "It's coming through the roof," Jake shouted, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed his rifle upwards. "The attic crawl space. I can get a shot from there." The crawl space was just a small opening in the ceiling, covered by a piece of plywood. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but it was the only one we had. I helped him shove the table under the opening. He scrambled up, pushed the plywood cover aside, and hauled himself into the pitch-black space above. "See anything?" I called out, my own rifle aimed at the groaning ceiling. "Nothing. It's too dark. Wait. I hear it. It's right above me." Suddenly, with a sound of splintering, cracking wood, a massive clawed hand punched through the roof, right next to where Jake must have been. It was followed by another. The creature was tearing the roof apart like it was cardboard. "Jake, "Get down!" I screamed. I heard a muffled cry from the attic, then the sound of a struggle. Jake's rifle clattered to the floor of the crawl space. "Art, it's got me! It's—" His voice was cut off in a choked gurgle. A section of the roof tore away completely, and for a horrifying second, I saw the creature's silhouette against the murky night sky. It was leaning over the hole, pulling something heavy out. It was pulling Jake out. "Run!" Jake screamed, one last desperate word. "Go!" That single word broke through my paralysis. He was sacrificing himself. He was buying me time. Grief and terror warred within me, but instinct took over. I couldn't save him. I could only honor his sacrifice. I grabbed the flare gun I kept for emergencies from my footlocker, stuffing a handful of extra cartridges into my pocket. I snatched my rifle and a box of ammunition. I didn't look back up at the ceiling. I couldn't. I ran to the door, threw the cots aside, and wrenched the heavy bar from its brackets. I burst out into the freezing night, the roar of the creature, and the terrible final sounds from the roof echoing behind me. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted off the porch and ran, plunging into the darkness of the woods, away from the path, away from the logging road. My only thought was to get into the thickest, most tangled part of the forest I could find, where its size might be a disadvantage. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face. My lungs burned with the frigid air. Behind me, I heard a sound of immense weight hitting the ground as the thing leaped from the roof. A moment later, a terrifying, triumphant howl ripped through the night. It wasn't mourning its wounds. It was celebrating its victory. And now, it was coming for me. The flight was a blur of primal fear. I wasn't a thinking man anymore. I was just an animal, fleeing a predator. I stumbled and fell, scrambled back to my feet, and kept running. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the woods with impossible speed. It was gaining. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw its yellow eyes, two floating points of malice in the darkness, closing the distance. I remembered the flare gun. My hands were numb with cold and shaking with adrenaline, but I managed to break it open and load a cartridge. Without stopping, I twisted, aimed into the darkness behind me, and fired. The flare shot out with a whoosh, arcing through the trees and exploding in a brilliant, searing red light. The sudden intense light caused the creature to cry out, a high-pitched sound of pain and surprise. I saw it clearly for a full 2 seconds in the red glare. It was shielding its eyes with one of its long arms, momentarily blinded. That was my chance. I veered hard to the right, scrambling down a steep, rocky ravine, sliding and tumbling through snow and loose scree. I landed hard at the bottom, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, listening. I could hear it roaring in anger and frustration up on the ridge, but it didn't seem to know where I had gone. The ravine had hidden my trail. I reloaded the flare gun, my heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I stayed low, using the ravine for cover, and began to move again, this time more slowly, more deliberately, heading south, toward the old logging road I knew was miles away. Every shadow was a monster. Every gust of wind was its breath on my neck. I moved for what felt like hours, a ghost in the dark woods, expecting at any moment to feel its claws sink into my back. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, I stumbled out of the trees and onto the gravel expanse of the logging road. I had made it. I was exhausted, battered, and bleeding from a dozen cuts, but I was alive. I fell to my knees in the middle of the road and wept. I wept for Jake, for Brian, and for the world I had known that no longer existed. A logging truck found me about an hour after sunrise. The driver, a big man named Frank, saw me staggering down the road, covered in dirt and blood, my rifle held in a white-knuckled grip. He thought I'd been mauled by a bear. In a way, I suppose he was right. He helped me into his cab, gave me a thermos of hot coffee, and drove me toward the nearest town with a state police post. I told them everything. I sat in a small, sterile interview room that smelled of stale coffee, and told two young, impassive troopers the entire story. I told them about the doe, the tracks, the sounds, the face in the window. I told them about Brian being taken, about Jake being pulled through the roof. I know I sounded crazy. My voice was hoarse, I was shaking uncontrollably, and there was a wild look in my eyes that I could feel but couldn't suppress. They listened patiently, taking notes. They were professional, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They sent a team out to the cabin. A few hours later, a detective came in to speak with me. He was older, with a tired, seen-it-all expression. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we found your cabin. It's been extensively damaged. We also found remains for both your friends." He paused, letting that sink in. "The scene is consistent with an animal attack, a severe one, most likely a large predatory black bear, possibly rabid or suffering from winter starvation." "That was no bear," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "Did you see the tracks? Did you see the hole in the roof? A bear didn't do that. A bear doesn't try to open a door." He gave me a pitying look. "The snow around the cabin is too disturbed to make out any clear prints. As for the damage, a desperate and powerful animal can do surprising things. Sir, you've been through a horrific trauma. It's common for the mind to fill in blanks, to try and make sense of something that is senseless." They were dismissing me. They were writing it off. The official report would say, "bear attack." The case would be closed. Jake and Brian would become a statistic, a cautionary tale for hunters. The truth would be buried along with them. I was released later that day, after giving my formal statement, and was driven home to my empty house in town by a deputy who didn't say a single word the entire way. The next few weeks were a fog of funerals, insurance calls, and condolences from people who looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. The story got out, the sanitized official version. But whispers followed me. The old DNR officer who went crazy in the woods, the man who survived the bear attack that killed his two friends. Some probably thought I had done it myself. About a month after the incident, a sheriff's deputy I didn't recognize showed up at my door. He was old, near retirement, with a face like a worn leather boot. He said he was just following up, but his eyes told a different story. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table. "I read your statement, Art," he said quietly, after a long silence. "The unofficial one, the one you gave the troopers before they decided what the story was going to be." I just nodded, my hands wrapped around my mug. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've been working this county for 40 years, seen a lot of strange things. We get a call every few years. A hunter vanishes, a campsite torn apart, always up in the deep woods, usually in the Ottawa. Officially, it's a bear, or they got lost and succumbed to the elements. But the details, sometimes the details don't add up. Things get found that don't make it into the reports. Tracks that are too big. Bodies that are, well, like you described that deer." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "I'm not saying I know what you saw, but I'm saying I believe you saw something. My advice to you? You sell that cabin. You don't go up there again. And you stop talking about it. Some things in those woods are old, and they don't like being noticed. You got noticed, and you were lucky enough to walk away. Don't push that luck. He finished his coffee, stood up, and left. He never told me his name. He was the only person who believed me. His quiet validation was both a comfort and a confirmation of the true horror of it all. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a secret kept by the woods themselves and by the old men who knew better than to talk about it. I sold the cabin and the land for a fraction of what it was worth. I couldn't set foot on the property again. I haven't been in the deep woods since that day. I tried once. I drove to a state park, a place I knew well, and I walked about 50 feet down a well-marked trail. But the silence was there. The same oppressive, listening silence. The feeling of being watched. I turned around and practically ran back to my car, my heart pounding in my ears. The place that was once my sanctuary is now the source of my deepest terror. I live in town now, a small house with streetlights outside the window. I don't sleep well. Every time a branch scrapes against the roof in the wind, I'm back in that cabin. I see that face in the window, those intelligent, hateful yellow eyes. I hear Jake's last scream. Survivor's guilt is a heavy blanket. Why me? Why did I get to run while he was torn apart? It's a question I'll carry to my grave. Sometimes I go online, late at night, and I look for stories. I type in phrases I'm ashamed of. Dogman sightings, Michigan. Bipedal canine. And I find them. Hundreds of them. Scattered reports from all over, dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But I read the details, and they match. The impossible height, the canine head, the long arms, the unnatural intelligence. I am not the only one. We are a quiet, scattered community of survivors, each of us isolated by a truth too terrible for the world to accept. The world is not as safe as we pretend it is. We build our cities and our towns, pave our roads, and light up the darkness with our electricity. And we convince ourselves that we have tamed the wild. But we haven't. We've only pushed it back, into the deep, forgotten corners of the map. And in those places, things still exist. Old things. Things that hunt and hate and walk on two legs. So this is my warning. If you are ever in the woods, the deep woods, and you feel that sudden, inexplicable chill, if the forest goes unnaturally quiet, if you get that primal feeling that you are being watched by something you cannot see, do not dismiss it. Do not rationalize it. Trust that feeling. It is the oldest part of your brain, screaming a warning that your modern mind has forgotten how to hear. Turn around and walk away. Get back to your car. Get back to the lights. Do not, for any reason, stay to find out what is watching you. Because I did, and I am telling you now, you do not want to see what I saw. You do not want to know that such things are real.